January came in without warning that year, the kind of cold that arrived overnight and stayed for a month. Ezra Whitlock woke before sunrise to silence that felt wrong. Not the silence of a sleeping house. The silence of a house that had stopped fighting the wind. He lay still for a moment, listening. No draft slipping under the door. No rattle in the window frame. No cold find his feet the way it had every morning since October. He walked to the far wall, the one packed with hay before the first frost, the one his neighbor had called a fool's mistake in front of his own sister. He pressed his palm flat against it. It was not warm. It did not need to be warm. It was simply not cold, and after the winter he had just survived. That difference felt like a verdict. 3 cabins down the ridge. Walter Doss had burned nearly double the firewood he burned the winter before, and his walls still wept condensation onto the floorboards by morning. Nobody in the valley had believed hay could hold back a Montana January, least of all Walter, who had said so loudly in October. But something had happened between the laughter and this morning, something that had nearly cost Ezra more than his pride. This is the story of a wall nobody trusted, a mistake that almost proved a mockery right, and the one detail an old man nobody listened to finally explain before it was too late. If you're watching this from somewhere cold tonight, tell us where. Stories like this one survive because people still care enough to remember them. And if frontier wisdom like this matters to you, subscribing helps keep it alive. By the middle of October, Ezra Whitlock had a roof for walls and $11. He counted the money twice on the same evening, as though counting it a second time might change the number. It did not. $11 would not buy milled lumber for proper insulation, and it would not buy enough stone to line the walls before the ground froze hard enough to stop him from digging a foundation trench for anything more. He had built the cabin himself, board by board, through the late summer, working from sunrise until his hands would no longer close around the hammer. His sister Nora, 14 years old and quieter than she had been before her parents died of the fever 2 winters back, had carried water and nails and had not once complained, which worried Ezra more than complaining would have. The walls stood, but they stood thin, single plank thin, with gaps a person could see daylight through if they knew where to look. Ezra knew where to look. He had built the thing, and he had built in a hurry, because a hurry was the only speed he could afford. He walked the perimeter of the cabin that evening, running his hand along the boards, feeling for the places where the wind would find its way in first. There were more of those places than he wanted to admit. The land itself had not helped. He had bought it cheap, because it was mostly stone and slope, unsuitable for the kind of foundation work that took real lumber and real time. The previous owner had walked away from it after 2 seasons, telling anyone who would listen that the ground was cursed. Ezra did not believe in cursed ground. He believed in ground that was hard to work and expensive to improve, which was a different kind of curse, one that did not require superstition to explain. That night, he sat at the small table inside the cabin and did the arithmetic again, the way a man does when he already knows the answer and is only hoping the numbers will be kindled the second time. Lumber for proper insulation would cost more than he had. Stone would take longer to quarry and haul than the weeks remaining before the first hard frost. Nora needed a warm room before either of those things could happen, and needed it soon. Ezra looked out the window at the fields beyond the cabin, gold and dry in the last of the autumn light, and an idea began to take shape that he was not yet ready to say out loud. The idea had not come from a book, and it had not come from any plan Ezra had drawn himself. It had come from a conversation he barely remembered having, months earlier, with a freight driver who passed through on his way north. The man had mentioned, almost as an aside, that some of the old countries packed their walls with straw or hay between the timber framing, sealed over with a layer of clay. He had said it the way a man mentions the weather in a place he is only passing through, without weight, without detail, and had moved on to another subject before Ezra thought to ask him anything more. Ezra had not thought of it again until the night he sat doing arithmetic that refused to change. Hay he had in abundance. He had cut and stacked more of it than his small number of livestock could eat through the winter, a surplus he had planned to sell for a little extra money in the spring. Clay, the creek bed 2 miles east held plenty of it, free for the digging. It was not a plan so much as the absence of any other plan. Ezra understood the difference, and he understood that a man who chooses a method because it costs nothing is not the same as a man who chooses it because he trusts it. He did not trust it. Not yet. But he lay awake that night turning the idea over anyway, testing it against what little he knew of how walls were supposed to work. Air trapped between materials held still, and still air was harder for coal to move through than a single thin board with a draft running behind it. That much, he reasoned, made a kind of sense, even if he could not have explained why in any technical language. What worried him was everything he did not know. Whether hay packed into a wall would hold its shape through a winter of shifting temperatures. Whether moisture would find its way in and turn the whole thing to rot before January. Whether mice would treat the walls of his cabin as an invitation. He had no answers to any of that. He had only a freight driver's offhand comment, a field full of hay, and a calendar that was not going to wait for him to feel certain. The next morning, he told Nora what he intended to do. She looked at him for a long moment, the way she had taken to looking at him since their parents died, as though measuring whether this was a decision born of wisdom or exhaustion. "Have you ever seen it done?" she asked. "No," Ezra admitted. "Then how do you know it works?" He did not have a good answer. He had a field of hay, a creek full of clay, and 6 weeks before the world turned white. Word travels fast in a valley with few families in it. And by the end of that week, Walter Dawes had heard what Ezra Whitlock intended to do with his cabin walls. Walter was not a cruel man, and it would be unfair to remember him only for what he said that October afternoon, standing at the edge of Ezra's property with his hat pushed back and his arms crossed. Walter had ranched in that valley for 11 years. He had lost cattle to blizzards that came without warning, had watched his own first attempt at a root cellar flood, and ruin a winter's worth of stores, and had earned every ounce of caution he carried about anything untested. "Hey, rots," Walter said, not unkindly, but plainly, the way a man states a fact he considers beyond argument. "It rots, it draws mice, and dry as it sits against it all winter, it's kindling waiting on a spark. You'd be better off nailing up burlap sacks and praying." Nora stood a few steps behind Ezra during this conversation, and Walter's words landed on her differently than they landed on Ezra. Ezra had chosen this path, and could carry the doubt as his own. Nora had not chosen anything. She only had to live inside whatever her brother built, and Walter's warning settled into her the way cold settles into a room with a gap under the door. "I've seen it mentioned," Ezra said. "Sealed proper, with clay over it. Mentioned," Walter repeated, and there was no real malice in the word. Only a rancher's weathered skepticism toward anything that arrived in a valley by rumor instead of by proof. "I buried 2 calves this year on things that were mentioned to me as sure fixes. You want to bet your sister's winter on a story a stranger told you on the road." Ezra had no honest answer to that either. He said nothing, and the silence stretched long enough that Walter eventually shook his head, wished them both well in a flat tone of a man who believes he is watching a mistake unfold, and rode back toward his own ranch. That night, Nora asked her brother directly whether Walter was right. Ezra did not know how to promise her that he was not. All he could offer was a plan, unfinished and unproven, and the knowledge that the alternative, thin walls and an empty purse, was not really an alternative at all. "We'll know by January," he told her, and neither of them found much comfort in the honesty of it. The work began the following morning, and it was slower and more exacting than Ezra had expected. He built a simple frame between the existing wall studs, Thin strips of scrap would nail horizontally to hold the packed hay in place and keep it from settling into the lower half of each wall cavity over time. Nora worked beside him for most of it, her hands quick with the smaller tasks, even as her expression remained guarded, watchful, the look of someone reserving judgment until the evidence came in. The hay itself needed to be packed tight, tighter than either of them expected on the first attempt. Loosely stacked, it left pockets of open air large enough for a draft to move through freely, defeating the entire purpose of the work. Ezra learned this the hard way, filling the first section of wall with hay stuffed in by hand, and stepping back satisfied, only to hold a lit candle near the seams at evening and watch the flame bend sideways in a breeze. He should not have been able to feel indoors at all. He tore the section out and started again, this time compressing the hay by hand in smaller batches, forcing it down hard against the layer beneath before adding more. It was slower. His hands blistered and then calloused over following days. But the candle no longer bent when he tested the second attempt. Over the packed hay, Ezra applied a layer of clay mixed with water from the creek, worked into a paste thick enough to hold its shape without sliding down the wall before it dried. He had never plastered anything in his life, and the first coats were uneven, thicker in some places than others, prone to hairline cracking as they dried in the cold autumn air. Nora, watching him struggle with the clay one afternoon, suggested mixing in a portion of the same straw that filled the walls, chopped fine, the way she had once seen her mother strengthen mud for a chimney repair back when they still lived on the old farm. Ezra tried it. The cracking lessened considerably. It was the first correction that had not come from Ezra's own trial and error, and he found himself grateful for it in a way he did not fully say out loud, though Nora seemed to understand anyway. By the last week of October, 3 of the 4 walls stood packed and sealed, rough-looking but solid under the palm. The 4th wall, the one facing the coldest prevailing wind, remained unfinished when the first real frost arrived early, 3 days ahead of anything Ezra had planned for. The trouble started in the section of wall Ezra had finished first, the one he had been proudest of, ironically enough, because it had gone up fastest. A week of unseasonably wet weather moved through the valley in early November. Rain turned into sleet and back to rain again. And on the 3rd night of it, Nora woke Ezra with a smell he did not want to identify before he had even opened his eyes. It was the smell of hay left too long in a damp place, sweet and rotten at once, the smell of a barn that had not been mucked out properly. He rose and found the source quickly enough. Water had found a seam near the base of the fastest finished wall, seeping along a gap where the clay seal had never fully closed, and the hay behind it had gone dark and matted, warm to the touch in a way that had nothing to do with insulation and everything to do with the early stages of rot. Ezra tore the section open that same night, working by lantern light, while Nora held the light steady and said nothing, though her silence carried more weight than any accusation would have. The hay inside had compressed into a wet, sour mass, and a section of the exterior board behind it had already begun to soften. He worked until nearly dawn, pulling the ruined material free, exposing the bare frame to the cold night air, the very cold the whole project had been meant to keep out. In the morning, Nora sat wrapped in a blanket near the stove, coughing lightly, more from the damp chill of the disturbed room than any real illness, though the sound of it struck Ezra harder than Walter Doss's warnings ever had. He said it would rot, she said quietly, not as an accusation, simply as a fact now confirmed. Ezra did not defend the method that morning. He could not with the evidence pulled out onto the frozen ground beside the cabin, dark and sour and undeniable. What he understood, standing there in the cold with ruined hay at his feet, was that the failure was not proof the whole idea was wrong. It was proof that somewhere in his execution, water had found a way in that should never have been left open, and until he understood exactly where and why, every other section of wall he had built carried the same risk, waiting quietly behind clay that looked solid but might not be. Ezra found Otto Brenner 3 days later, mending a fence line on a small, poor parcel of land near the eastern edge of the valley, land nobody else had wanted badly enough to buy. Otto had come from the old country as a young man, decades before Ezra was born, and the valley had never quite made room for him the way it made room for families who arrived with English already comfortable in their mouths. People were polite to Otto. They were rarely curious about him, and it had not occurred to Ezra, until the ruined wall left him without better options, to wonder what Otto might actually know. Ezra explained what happened, the rot, the seam, the smell that still lingered faintly in his cabin. Otto listened without interrupting, then walked the fence line a while longer before he finally spoke. "You packed it, then sealed it once and called it finished," Otto said. It was not quite a question. "That's right." Otto shook his head, not unkindly. "The clay is not decoration. It is not something you paint on and forget. It must be worked into every seam, every corner, thick enough in some places that you would think you had used too much. One thin coat looks finished to the eye. It is not finished to the water." He went on to describe a technique he remembered from his youth. A second layer applied only after the first had fully dried and cracked. The cracks then packed deliberately with a thicker paste, sealing the wall in a way that a single smooth coat never could. The hay itself needed to be packed dry, bone dry, and pressed hard enough that a man's fist could not easily push into it. Any looseness left room for both moisture and mice, exactly as Walter had warned, though Walter had never known the correction that made the warning avoidable. "Why has no one else done this here?" Ezra asked. Otto's expression did not change much, though something in his voice thinned slightly. "No one has asked me anything in 11 years. Ezra rode home with the correction laid out clearly in his mind for the first time since the idea had begun. No longer a rumor from a passing freight driver, but a method with an actual shape to it. One built from a lifetime Otto Brenner had spent watching, mostly in silence, while Valley walked past his gate without stopping. Ezra reworked every wall the following 2 weeks, applying Otto's second layer of clay to each seam, packing the hay tighter than before, and this time testing each section with the same lit candle trick, watching carefully for any flame that so much as trembled. None did, not by the time he finished. The first true test came in early December, a 2-day storm that dropped heavy snow and drove temperatures down hard enough to freeze the creek solid at its edges. It was not the deepest cold the valley would see that winter, but it was cold enough to matter, cold enough to separate a wall that worked from a wall that merely looked finished. Ezra and Nora spent the storm indoors, feeding the stove modestly, watching their breath in the lamplight to judge how cold the room truly was. By the second morning, the fire had burned low and slow through the night, and the room had not turned bitter the way it once would have. Nora placed her palm against the reworked wall near her bed and held it there a long moment. "It's not warm," she said. "It's not supposed to be warm," Ezra answered. "It's supposed to slow the cold down. That's all it ever was going to do." It was a small victory, and Ezra was careful not to overstate it, even to himself. A 2-day storm was not a Montana winter. It was not the 6-week stretch of unbroken cold the valley sometimes endured in a hard year, and was certainly not the kind of test that would silence a man like Walter Doss, who had not mentioned the cabin walls again, but had also not stopped by to check on them either. Still, something had shifted. Nora no longer asked whether Walter was right. She had stopped bracing for smell of rot each time she woke. The candle no longer bent. Ezra allowed himself, for the first time since October, to believe the wall might actually hold, though he understood the difference between a storm surviving comfortably and a true test still waiting somewhere ahead in the depth of winter, a test the valley had not yet delivered. The storm that arrived in the second week of January gave the valley almost no warning at all. The sky had been clear the morning it began, cold but ordinary, and within 6 hours the wind had shifted hard out of the north, driving snow sideways and dropping the temperature further than any storm the valley had seen that season. It was, by every account later given, the worst 2 nights of that winter. Nora fell the evening before it hit, a sore throat, and a low fever that Ezra suspected had started the previous night, when she had briefly slept in the unfinished lean-to room at the back of the cabin while helping move stores in from the cold. That room had no packed walls at all, only bare board, and the difference between it and the rest of the cabin was not subtle. By the time the storm reached its worst, somewhere past midnight on the first night, Nora's fever had climbed enough that Ezra moved her bedding into the main room, close to the stove, close to the reworked walls he had spent 2 months building and rebuilding. He fed the fire carefully through the night, rationing what he could not easily replace until the roads cleared, and watched the wind test every seam of the cabin a way it had tested nothing before. He heard it find the old lean-to immediately, a low, constant moan through the thin boards. He listened for that same sound along the packed walls, and heard, instead, almost nothing. Nora slept fitfully, her fever rising slightly before dawn, and Ezra sat awake beside her, one hand resting flat against the nearest wall, more out of need for reassurance than any real ability to judge its temperature by touch alone. By the second morning, the storm had not yet broken, but the room had held, not warm in any comfortable sense, but steady, the kind of steady that meant the stove's heat was not escaping as fast as it once would have, was not being replaced hour after hour by air pulled straight off the open plains. Nora's fever broke sometime before noon. Gradually, the way fevers do in a body is finally given room to rest instead of fight the cold, as well as the illness. Ezra did not know, and could never fully prove, how much of her recovery belonged to the walls and how much simply belonged to time. What he knew was that she had not spent that storm shivering, and in a winter that had already taken so much from families up and down the valley, that alone felt like more than he had dared to hope for in October. The storm broke on the third day, and the valley dug itself out slowly, the way it always did, neighbors checking on neighbors, roads cleared one wagon width at a time. Walter Doss arrived at Ezra's cabin 2 days after the roads opened, and he did not arrive with an apology. Exactly. Walter was not the kind of man who found apologies easy. He arrived instead with a question, standing at the same spot near the edge of the property where he had once predicted rot and ruin, hat in his hands rather than pushed back on his head. "Your place still standing warm?" he asked, and there was something careful in the way he asked it, a man testing ground he was not certain would hold his weight. Ezra told him plainly. The packing, the sealing, the failure in November, the correction Otto Brenner had offered when no one else in the valley had thought to ask him anything at all. He did not dress up the story or smooth over the parts where he had nearly ruined the whole attempt through his own impatience. Walter listened without interrupting, the same way Otto once had, and when Ezra finished, Walter only nodded slowly, turning his hat once in his hands. 11 years I've been burning double the wood I probably need to, he said, more to himself than to Ezra. Might be time I asked that old German a few questions myself. He did, within the month, and by the following autumn, 2 more cabins in the valley carried packed walls behind their boards, built with Otto Brenner's guidance and a great deal more patience than Ezra had managed on his first attempt. Nora never spoke much about that January storm afterward, though she kept for years a small jar of the dry clay that had cracked and been repaired on the wall nearest her bed, a fragment Ezra had pried loose during a later repair and handed to her, without either of them quite explaining why it mattered. The wall itself was never beautiful. It never stopped looking like what it was, a poor man's answer to a problem money could not solve that year. But it held, through that January and the ones that followed, not because it fought the cold directly, but because it gave the cold fewer ways in, and in a valley where so much depended on the smallest of margins, that difference was the one that mattered. This story is presented for educational and historical storytelling purposes. It is not engineering, construction, or safety advice.